So let's start talking about some macromolecules. The first group we'll talk about are carbohydrates. Later on, we'll talk about lipids. I'll probably save proteins and nucleic acids for another video. But carbohydrates here, we're talking about both the complex carbohydrates and starches as well as simple sugars. Just to run through the basics here, carbohydrates are compounds that are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The term carbohydrate does indicate something about their structure. The carbo comes from the carbon, and the hydrate indicates the same ratio hydrogen to oxygen in a carbohydrate that you're going to see in water, hydrate for water. There's good old C6H12O6, which is glucose or fructose or galactose. We'll talk about isomers later. The important thing here is that glucose is the primary fuel source for all living things. So there, as far as carbohydrates go, an important function is energy, not just as the raw fuel, but also because we can glue these molecules together and form starches, just like potatoes do for storing energy. And as well as start to make complex carbohydrates for cell walls or insect exoskeletons, the crunchy parts of insects. It's important also for us to note that the monomer, the repeating unit of complex carbohydrates, are simple sugars. The names of sugars are also important. Nomenclature is something we should be aware of. They do usually end in "-ose", so terms that end in "-ose" are indicating that it is a sugar. They are classified by the number of things in the ring. It doesn't have to be a carbon. Sometimes it's oxygen, as you can see in ribose there, and deoxyribose. Glucose is a hexose sugar because there are 6 members in the ring. Deoxyribose and ribose there, and fructose even are pentose sugars with 5 carbons. There are trioses. You'll notice that's not in a ring. It doesn't have to be in a ring structure, but that is a triose. They're glyceraldehyde, which we will discuss when we get into energy. Just a quick run through the functional groups in case you forgot or need to review from the last time. There are some functional groups that we should be familiar with, like the carbonyl. Aldehydes are compounds that have a carbonyl, where the carbon is attached to at least one organic compound, one carbon. Ketones are attached to 2. There are aldoses, the types these are sugars that are open, that are not in the ring structure, where they'll have a hydroxyl group. It is also important for us to recognize that sugars will and can be found in their open and ring forms. Pure sugars are linear or ring forms, but when we start to dissolve them in aqueous solutions, they take on the ring structure. Since we're going to be talking about living things that are large aqueous solutions, we're always talking about the ring structure. We should know something about the way carbons are numbered, however. Carbons are numbered based on which carbon you are relative to the oxygen that is on the terminal carbonyl group in the aldose. For our purposes here, we're talking about this first carbon attached to the oxygen, going all the way around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 prime. The 6 prime in glucose is the one that's hanging off the end. Just to describe them from simple to complex, we have monosaccharides. These are the simple sugars with 1 ring. Those come together to form disaccharides like sucrose, which are 2 rings. And then we can start adding those rings together and start to make polysaccharides, which are the polymers forming starches. To make a disaccharide, we are going to go, like I said before, through good old dehydration synthesis involving monosaccharides. Again, this is an enzymatic reaction, this here forming maltose, where 2 glucose molecules come together through dehydration synthesis. This bond that is formed is between the 2 simple sugars is referred to as a glycosidic linkage. to take a moment to talk a little more about those polymers of sugars, the polysaccharides. It's pretty simple. It takes not a whole lot of energy to start to bond those simple sugars together to make the complex carbohydrates. So these make for really good stores of energy. And both plants and animals do utilize this, taking excess amounts of sugar, simple sugar molecules, and gluing them together into starches like glycogen or amylose, amylopectin. Because of this ease at which you can make complex carbohydrates, or plants can, they also are used as building materials, making cell walls, and certainly we see this in animals as well, as arthropods use them to make the exoskeletons. I hinted before at amylose. We have been talking about these polymers as long chains, but they don't have to be linear. They can be branched. This is the difference between amylose, which is a simple starch, and amylopectin, which is a little more complex. We start to see different bonds between the simple sugars. And that forms a branching pattern. When we start to look at glycogen, we see that the branches have branches, and so it becomes very complex. This is very helpful because the molecules that are going to digest these starches to yield the simple sugars for energy start on the ends of the molecule, and so if you have lots of branches, that yields lots of ends, and it makes it really efficient to utilize glycogen as an energy source when necessary. Not all glucoses are the same. It's a little strange. When we start talking about the stereoisometry of glucose, the nuts and bolts of this are not something that'll be on the AP exam, although it is interesting and certainly kind of cool. This carbon right here is kind of special because it's attached to four different things. Here's a hydrogen, here's an oxygen, here's a carbon, here's a hydroxy group. Because it's attached to these four different things, it has a cool characteristic that's called stereoisometry. It has handedness, kind of like your left and your right hand are they're the same thing, the thumbs, and they're all arranged, but they're not superimposable over one another. And so you can't put your left hand in your right hand glove. And that's important for us as biochemists because shape is going to be very important in order for enzymes to be able to complex with substrate, since that is a shape-shape interaction. When things start to have different shapes, then that starts to affect whether it's going to be able to be complexed with that particular enzyme. Love potatoes. Love them. Why do we like potatoes so much? Well, because potatoes store their excess glucose in alpha glucose molecules in a long chain in a form of starch that you and I have enzymes that we can break down and utilize. Now, cellulose is also a chain of glucose molecules, C6H12O6 attached to another C6H12O6 all the way on down the line. But the reason why you and I can't go out and eat, hay like a cow, is because we lack the enzymes. We don't have cellulase that we need in order to break down the different type of 1,4 glycosidic linkage between those beta glucose molecules. It changes the shape of the molecule enough that it doesn't complex with enzymes that you and I have. We do have enzymes that can complex with the alpha glucose monomers all in a chain, but not the beta glucose monomers in a chain. Cellulose, unfortunately for us, is like the most common compound out there, and it's too bad that we can't use it as an energy source because it's got a lot of energy in it. Diabetes is a condition where a person has difficulty maintaining a stable blood sugar. People who are insulin dependent need to be able to look at the food that they're eating and have an idea of how that's going to affect their blood sugar. So different foods are given what's called a glycemic index. The glycemic index is just that. It tells how quickly that food is going to raise the blood sugar. So of all these different compounds, these different foods, these different fuels, of all these different foods, which one's going to raise your blood sugar the most? Well, peanut M&Ms, candy, which you might think, oh wow, that's candy's going to raise it quickly, has one of the lower glycemic indexes. Natural fruits also pretty good as far as keeping your blood sugar relatively low. Once we get into complex carbohydrates like bagels, which are actually soaked in malt if they're done right, uh, have quite a bit of sugar in them and quite a bit of carbohydrate. That's all they are. But really, the bad guys are the rice cakes and the corn flakes. What do you think about it? That's breakfast cereal. It's supposed to like pick you up and give you the energy that you need to go through the morning.